morning. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday. How's everybody doing? Great. It is great. You know, we were just talking about this last night at that Jewish Journal event. You run into people, you say, how you doing? And if you're an upbeat person, you like to say good or great or... But these days with the war, I think the answer is, I would be good. I would be great. But you know, there's a limit to how good we can feel when our brothers and sisters are in harm's way. Nonetheless, thank God we are in the month of miracles. Kislev, may a miracle come soon. May peace be restored. May lives be saved. We say amen. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Tuesday? Stephen in New Hampshire, Bill in Missouri, Paul in the Great Northwest, Shandora in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Bella in Florida, and Frank in San Pedro, Karen in Northern California, Jonathan in Southern California, Sharon wishing us all a Hodesh Tov from Lebanon, New Jersey, Joe in the Inland Empire, Nancy in North Carolina, Joseph in Lowell, Massachusetts, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in North Carolina, and Spencer. Where are you, Spencer? There's like a thing blocking this. Okay, we'll let that go. Welcome, everybody. We're going to do 2 pages, so buckle your seatbelts. As we keep working hard to catch up with the Daf Yomi schedule. So our pages are 9 and 10. We would pick it up at the bottom of page 8b. But we're going to just skip a little. So at the end of yesterday, we were talking about some examples where the law got a little complicated. The general idea, we're talking about damages, right? Here in Tractate Bava, Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 in chapter 1. And this idea that there's 4 categories of damages and what they all have in common is that if you become liable to pay these damages to an injured party, and you don't have money on hand or movable property on hand with which to pay the damages, and you have to give land to the injured party, okay, so then the land that you give him is superior quality land. Why? Because that's the land that's going to be the easiest to sell if the injured party actually needs money to make himself whole because of the injury that you did to him or her. Then, once we got into the subject of you have to use superior quality land, we compared that to a creditor who is only entitled to intermediate quality land, or a woman who needs to receive payment of a marriage contract upon a divorce, for example, who is only entitled to receive from inferior quality land from the husband. And then what happens if, okay, so a creditor has a lien on somebody's land, but then that guy sells the land to a third party, and maybe that third party sells the land to yet another party. How far does the lien reach? That we talked about at the end of yesterday. The example that we're skipping today is how far does the lien reach if the one who initially purchased the land from the borrower, right, that had a lien on the land from his creditor. Well, what if the borrower, in selling the land, gives a guarantee to the purchaser that, okay, if my creditor comes along and seizes that land from you because I didn't pay my debt, I guarantee that you will be made whole. That would be a pretty wise, what do you call it? Paragraph, let's say, to add to the purchase contract, to the purchase agreement when you buy land. But it's a little bit off topic here in our discussion of damages, categories of damages, and how we make someone whole when a party when somebody incurs damages. Okay, so we pick this up a little bit of the way down on page 9a. Where the Gemara returns to its earlier discussion concerning the form of the payment of damages. So Rav Huna says, damages are paid either with money or with one's best quality land. And Rav Nachman raised an objection to Rav Huna from a Baraisa. The verse states, Exodus 21:34, that he shall recompense money to its owner, right? So it seems like if you do harm to somebody, you give him money. And this serves to include not only money, but items worth money, even a low quality item like bran. So Rav Huna replied, with what are we dealing here in the Baraisa? We are dealing with a case where he does not have any money or land. Then he can use movable items. And the Gemara asks, if he does not have any other means with which to pay, it is obvious, isn't it obvious that he can pay using what he has? So the Gemara explains, lest you say that we would say to him, go to the trouble of selling whatever commodity you own and thereby bring money to the one you harmed. This Baraisa teaches us that it is unnecessary to sell one's possessions in order to pay with money. Rather, if you can get the item that, what you have in your possession, let's say, a pile of bran cereal, a pile of bran grain, you can have that appraised and just give that to the one that you injured. You don't have to first liquidate it and then bring the money. So Rav Asi says, money is equivalent to land. And the Gemara asks, with regard to what law are they equivalent? If we say that it is with regard to fulfilling the requirement of paying with one's best quality land, meaning that he can choose to pay with money instead, well, this is precisely the ruling of Rav Huna. And yet, the ruling of Rav Asi is presented as an independent ruling. So what is he adding that we don't already know? So it must be that Rav Asi is referring to a case of two brothers who divided their inheritance. And one took land and the other took money. And subsequently, their father's creditor came and took the land as it was liened to his loan. That's very interesting, right? You can imagine there's two brothers, their father dies and leaves them money and land, right? And one brother already has some, let's say one brother is, he's a farmer. His natural character is to be a farmer. And the other brother has wanderlust, right? He wants to go travel the world, maybe set up his life in a new city. So it makes sense. One guy takes the money, the other guy takes the land. But then this creditor that they didn't even know about of the father comes along and says, your father owed me money. I had a lien on this field. Here's the field. I'm taking it. So the brother that got the money, he's got all the money. But the brother that took the land, now he doesn't have the land anymore. So is the brother that chose to take the land now out of luck? Or do we redivide the estate so that still we have a division where the brothers split the inheritance? So Rav Asi's ruling teaches us that this brother whose land was taken can go and take half the share of the money together with his brother, right? That they do redivide what's left in the estate after this creditor comes along and seizes the land. But the Gemara rejects this explanation. That's obvious, right? Isn't this obvious? Is this one son and that other one not a son? Since they are both sons and they equally inherited the estate of their father, they share responsibility for their father's debts. If the creditor takes repayment of the debt from one brother, the other one must reimburse him. We know that already. We don't need Rav Asi's ruling to tell us that. So is that really what Rav Asi is telling us? Well, there are those who say that the Gemara rejects this explanation not because it is obvious, but on the contrary, because it is wrong. As one could look at it from the opposite direction, saying that one brother could say to the other brother, it was with this understanding that I took the money, that if the money would be stolen from me, I would not be reimbursed from your land, right? Look at it the other way. So one brother took the land, the other one took the money. The land is safe. The land's not going anywhere. The one who took the money, he's undertaking some risk, especially if he's going to go travel with it and he's holding that big bag of money and then somebody steals it. So yeah, then the brother who took the land, he still got his land. The brother that took the money loses all the money. Does the one who went traveling holding a bag of money have a right to go back to the brother that got the land and say, you know what? the money was stolen. It was our money, right? So now I want half the land. The one with the land would say, what are you talking about? You took the money. I took the land. It was your job to take care of the money. It was stolen from you. That's not my problem. So maybe likewise, the brother who opted to take the land undertook the risk that some of that or all of that land might be seized by a creditor. That would be the argument of the brother who took the money. At least that could be the argument. It was with this understanding that I took the money, that if it would be stolen from me, I would not be reimbursed from your land. And therefore, it was with this understanding that you took the land, that it would be, if it would be seized from you by a creditor, you would not be reimbursed from the money. So rather, Rav Asi is referring to a case of two brothers who divided the land that they inherited from their father. And their father's creditor came and took the portion of one of them. And since the brothers carried joint responsibility for their father's debt, the one whose portion was seized does have a right to be reimbursed from his brother because of Rav Asi's ruling. Now the Gemara asks, but didn't Rav Asi already explicitly say that ruling once before? Therefore, this cannot be the explanation of this ruling. Right, as we learned earlier, in a case of brothers who divided the land, not earlier in this tractate, but elsewhere, that in a case of brothers who divided the land that they inherited from their father, and their father's creditor came and took the portion of one of them, Rav says that the initial division of the land is voided and any remaining land is divided equally between the brothers. Shmuel says that each brother, upon taking his portion, relinquished any rights to be reimbursed if his portion were lost. And Rav Asi says that the brother whose portion was seized has a right to receive half of the remaining inheritance. He takes a quarter in land and he takes the other quarter in money, right? They do a whole new redivision according to Rav Asi. The law actually follows Rav, that whatever happened when they divided the land, land and money, whatever division they initially made at the time of the inheritance, if a creditor shows up later and takes a bunch of the land, now they void the original division. They look at the estate as it now is after the creditor took some of it, and now they redivide the estate. And, who knows what percentages of land and money they come up with that suits them in their particular situations, but they have to do the division of the estate all over again in these circumstances. We skip a few paragraphs. Now that we mentioned Rav Huna in these paragraphs that we're skipping, we actually go to a complete digression, a short digression, simply because Rav Huna was mentioned. And it's very interesting. Rabbi Zera says that Rav Huna says, for the purchase of an object with which to fulfill a mitzvah, one should spend up to 1/3. Now, what does that mean? Like, for example, during Sukkot, you have to spend money to build a sukkah. You have to spend money to purchase an etrog, right? We have Hanukkah coming up. We're going to have to light candles. Usually Americans light candles, but originally the way it was done was with oil lamps. So you would have to purchase oil. Or if you were doing a very expensive mitzvah, like commissioning a Torah, it's $50,000. And then you needed to, there are a lot of choices when you write a Torah. You could write a Torah that's this tall or this tall or this tall, very different cost. Then you put a Torah cover on it. You're going to make a very beautiful Torah cover, right? So there's this whole mitzvah of beautifying a mitzvah. And it's unclear if beautifying the mitzvah is just something you do when you perform a mitzvah, or if it's its own mitzvah. Okay. So here the Gemara is telling us that Rabbi Zera says in the name of Rav Huna that for the purchase of an object with which to fulfill a mitzvah, like an etrog, so one should spend up to 1/3. And what does that mean? 1/3 of what, right? And the Gemara asks, to what does this refer? 1/3 of what? If we say, and now we're on 9b, if we say that it means one should spend up to 1/3 of his estate, now that we're talking about estates, if we should spend up to 1/3 of his estate to perform a mitzvah, But if that is so, if it happened to him that he became obligated in 3 mitzvahs at the same time, should he give his entire estate away in order to fulfill these mitzvahs? One is certainly not required to do so. In fact, we learn elsewhere that we live by the mitzvahs, right? We don't die for the mitzvahs. I mean, you're not going to spend all the money you have in this world in order to perform a mitzvah, and then you become a pauper, and who knows what's going to happen to you. So rather, what Rabbi Zera said, and by the way, that is an opinion, that if you have very little money, but you are obligated to do a mitzvah, you should spend 1/3 of the money you have. And then this question of having 3 mitzvahs, it's not going to use up all your money. It's just 1/3 of what you have left. Okay, but that's only one opinion. Now, rather, what Rabbi Zera said is that for the embellishment of the performance of a mitzvah, right? So beautifying the mitzvah, making it more beautiful, nicer, finer, just a better version of the mitzvah. For example, to purchase a more beautiful item used in the performance of a mitzvah. So one should spend up to 1/3 more than the cost of the standard item used to perform the mitzvah. In other words, if you could get an etrog, right, that is not damaged, it's not disqualified in some way. So if you could get an etrog for $50 when Sukkot is coming, so you should spend up to 1/3 more than that to get a more beautiful etrog. Now, some people will spend much more than that, hundreds and hundreds of dollars. But at a minimum, they're saying that, well, if you get one for $50, you should be prepared to spend, 67, right? And adding 1/3. There's a discussion of, does that mean the inner third or the outer third? And that means 1/3 of the original price or 1/3 of the final price. In which case, if it was 1/3 of the final price, that would be like $75, right? Because it's the 25 is 1/3 of the final price on top of the 50. Or an inner third means 1/3 of the original price. 1/3 of 50 is about 17, so you would add that. And that's Rav Ashi's dilemma, the inner third or the outer third. It turns out it's the inner third. And in the West, meaning in Eretz Yisrael, as opposed to in Bava, right, in Babylonia, where this community was, in the West, they say, in the name of Rabbi Zera, of the money one spends on purchasing a more beautiful item to perform a mitzvah, up to 1/3 more than the cost of a standard item comes from his own finances. But from this point forward, any additional sum spent on purchasing a more beautiful item comes from the largesse of the Holy One, blessed be He, i.e., God will reimburse him for spending that additional sum. And an area where people often talk about this is that an area where people will often talk about this is like Shabbos, right? The money you spend on Shabbos to have a beautiful Shabbos dinner. Thanksgiving is coming up. And, as Americans, we're all accustomed to having a really big, really beautiful, really lavish meal, on Thanksgiving. What can I tell you? Shabbos dinner is like the full-on, we don't have a turkey, but it's a full-on Thanksgiving dinner every Friday night. It can be very expensive, especially because you're eating kosher food, which is already so high priced. But there is a tradition, perhaps it's learned right here from Rabbi Zera, that whatever you spend extra on Shabbos dinner to have a beautiful, wonderful, amazing, lavish Shabbos dinner, the Holy One, blessed be He, will somehow augment your income over the course of the year, and you'll get it back. So don't be afraid to spend lavishly for Shabbos dinner. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1. Now we go to Mishnah number 2. Here we go. With regard to anything for which I became responsible for safeguarding it to prevent it from causing damage, if it in fact causes damage, it is considered as if I actively facilitated that damage, and accordingly, I must pay for it, right? So anything that I'm responsible to safeguard, right? So the obvious example, we've been talking about an ox or a pit, right? I dig a pit in the public domain. Okay, now that's a hazard to everybody. I better put up warning signs and, like guardrails and tape and a sign, and I should maybe post a guard there to make sure nobody walking along falls into the pit. Or if I have an ox, right, that could get out and do damage, I got to make sure that it's tied up and it's not going to go, right? And so if I'm negligent and I don't safeguard this thing that is my responsibility to safeguard, then it's considered as if I actively caused the harm. Even though it was only through negligence, it's as if I actively caused the harm, and that's why I become liable to pay all of the damage. I am liable for the payments. I am liable for payments I am liable for payments of restitution for damage for damage that it caused, as if I were the one who facilitated the entire damage. And note the wording, not just I am liable as if I were the one who created the damage. I am liable for payments of restitution for the damage that it caused, as if I were the one who facilitated the entire damage. I'm sorry. Let me start again. With regard to anything that I am responsible for safeguarding, if I don't safeguard it and it ends up causing damage, then it is considered as if I actively facilitated that damage, and accordingly I must pay for it. Second concept. In any case in which I facilitated part of the damage that my pit or my ox or my fire caused, I become liable for payments of restitution for the damage it caused, as if I were the one who facilitated the entire damage, right? Being negligent is like actively causing damage, and if my negligence it was only partial cause of the damage, then I'm still responsible as if I caused the entire damage. Next, one is liable only with regard to damage caused to property for which, right? So now there's going to be 3 conditions on this of me being liable, which these conditions have to be met in order for me to have this liability. Number 1, that if I was to use this property for a non-sacred purpose, I would not be liable for misuse of consecrated property, right? So if like I was responsible for safeguarding a consecrated ox, and then that consecrated ox caused damage, me becoming liable is different, right? So we're not talking about that case right now. Number 2, condition for me to become liable is damage. Number 2 is that the damage that I caused was caused to another Jew, in this case, members of the covenant. Now, that's not to say that, and so what, Jews are not liable to pay non-Jews if you damage non-Jews? Of course we are, but that's in different area of the law. The Torah, in talking about you paying damages, is to your fellow Jew. In terms of damages to other people who are not Jews, it's just a different area of the law that covers that. Just like right now what we're talking about is without respect to consecrated property. If we were talking about damage to or by consecrated property, it's just another area of the law. And lastly, the condition is with regard to assigned property, and the Gemara will explain that when we get to it. Furthermore, and one is liable for damage caused in any place except for a domain designated exclusively for the use of the one responsible for the damage. In other words, my fire, my pit, my ox ended up doing damage to somebody not on my property, either in the public domain or in their property, but not on my property. If you come on my property and my ox does damage to you while you're on my property, different area of the law. When an animal or item that one is responsible to safeguard causes damage, the one liable for the damage caused by insufficiently safeguarding it is obligated to pay payments of restitution for damage with his best quality land, as we've already learned. That's Mishnah number 2. Here comes the Gemara. The sages taught a Baraisa that elucidates the Mishnah's ruling. With regard to anything for which I became responsible for safeguarding it to prevent it from causing damage, if it in fact causes damage, it is considered as if I actively facilitated that damage and accordingly must pay for it. How so? In the case, so that just makes sense, right? If I was negligent and my negligence caused the thing that it was incumbent on me to make sure it didn't harm other people. And because of my negligence, that thing harmed other people, my ox, my fire, my pit. Then it's as if I actively created that damage. Now he says, how so? And we're going to get into some examples of this. Very interesting. How so? In the case of an ox or a pit that one transferred to the care of a deaf, mute, an imbecile, or a minor, right? These are halakhically unqualified people, right? In other words, they are not responsible for their actions. A deaf mute, particularly in the ancient world, was somebody you could not be sure if he understood the instructions that he had been given. An imbecile, for sure, you can't count that he understood the instructions. And a minor is never legally responsible for their actions. So if you put your ox, your fire, or your pit in the care of somebody who's not legally qualified to have responsibility for it, obviously you've done something negligent, right? So in the case of an ox or a pit that one transferred to the care of deaf, mute, imbecile, or minor, whose presumed limited intellectual capacity means that they are deemed incapable of sufficiently safeguarding them from causing damage, and the ox or pit did indeed cause damage, the law is that since the owner of the ox or pit did not fulfill his duty to safeguard them, he is liable to pay for the damage. Which is not so in a corresponding case where the damage is caused by a fire. What? If I entrust my ox or my pit to these legally unqualified people, and then the ox or the pit do damage to someone, I'm liable. But if I entrust fire to these legally unqualified people, then I'm not liable? Is that what the Gemara is saying? As will be explained, you're only off the hook if that person was entrusted not with an actual fire, in which case you are liable for entrusting it to them, but rather if you entrusted them with an ember, something that in the natural course of events would not turn into a fire, but that halakhically unqualified person then fanned it into a fire, exercising some, something that we would not have predicted that person would create a fire, and you're not liable for that. Now, the Gemara explains, with what are we dealing when we say that, ox or pit entrusted to let's say a minor, the owner is liable, but fire not? So the Gemara says, with what are we dealing? If we say that the Baraisa deals with a tethered ox or a covered pit, which cannot cause damage in the manner in which the owner left them, then the case in the corresponding situation of fire, where he is not liable, is where one transferred an ember to one of limited halakhic competence, which, had it been left alone, would not have erupted into a fire and caused damage. Right? It's very different when you entrust somebody with a tethered ox or with a covered pit, or with a mere ember that's not an actual fire, because in the normal course of things, none of these three things will cause damage to anyone. But, says the Gemara, this cannot be correct, because if so, what is different here in the case of an ox or a pit, where one is liable, and what is different there in the case of fire that exempts him from liability? There seems to be no reason to differentiate between them if what you gave the minor was a tethered ox, a covered pit, or a mere ember. So rather, the Baraisa must be dealing with an untethered ox or an exposed pit, which can cause damage in the manner in which the owner left them. So if so, then the case in the corresponding situation of fire, where he is not liable, is where one transferred a flame to one of limited halakhic competence, which can also cause damage in this form. So the Gemara immediately rejects this. But if so, why does the Baraisa state, which is not the case of damage caused by fire, as one is exempt from paying damages? But this is untenable. As didn't Reish Lakish say in the name of Chizkiah, they taught that one is exempt from damage caused by a fire only in a case where he transferred an ember to one of limited halakhic competence, who then fanned it into a flame of his own will. But if he transferred a flame to a minor, a deaf mute, or an imbecile, then the one who transferred the flame to him is liable for any damage that the flame caused. And what is the reason? He's responsible because the capacity for it to cause damage, an open flame, is certain. So the Gemara returns to its initial suggestion. Actually, the ruling of the Baraisa is stated with regard to a tethered ox or a covered pit, and the case in the corresponding situation of fire, where he is not liable, is where one transferred an ember to one of limited halakhic competence. And with regard to that which you said, in order to reject this, what is different here in the case of an ox in a pit that causes him to be liable, and what is different there in the case of fire that exempts him from liability? Seemingly, in all these cases, the item was not able to cause damage in its current form, so he is exempt from liability. So the Gemara explains, you could answer this question as follows. The typical manner of an ox, it might be tethered, but oxen will often free themselves from a rope. It's quite a rope that you need to have to ensure that an ox will not free himself, because oxen are so strong. And it is the typical manner of a pit for its cover to become dislodged. Okay, you covered the pit, but if you leave that pit for a long time, with that cover, eventually that cover is going to collapse or rot or fall or somehow become dislodged. Therefore, as it is negligent to transfer an ox or a pit to someone who is incapable of sufficiently safeguarding them, the one who transferred the ox or the flame to them is liable. By contrast, or a flame, right? Or the one who transferred an ox, even if it's tethered, or a pit, even if it's covered, is definitely going to be liable. But by contrast, with regard to an ember, as long as he leaves it alone, it will progressively dim, right? It's not going to remain a hazardous thing. If you give someone an ember, then pretty soon it's going to go out. And the only way in which it will cause damage is if someone else actively fans it into a flame, and that's why he's not liable if he transfers the ember to this halakhically incompetent person, but he is liable if he transfers a covered pit or a tethered ox to such a person. Skip a couple of paragraphs about fire and its nuance. And the sages taught there is a stringency that applies to the category of ox as opposed to the category of pit. And conversely, there is a stringency that applies to pit as opposed to ox. And the Bryce elucidates the stringency that applies to ox as opposed to pit is that if the ox kills a Jew, the owner is liable to pay a ransom to the victim's heirs. That's explicitly written in the Torah. And for killing a slave, the owner of the ox is liable to pay 30 selah to the slave's master. Again, explicitly in the written Torah. Furthermore, in such a case, once the court hears the evidence and the verdict of the ox is complete, and the court rules that the ox must be killed, it is prohibited to derive any benefit from the ox because it killed someone. And from then, it is considered that the typical manner of the ox is to proceed and cause damage. All of this is not so in the case of a pit that caused damage. And the stringency, i.e. the reason to be stringent that applies to a pit as opposed to an ox, is that with regard to the primary category of pit, its initial formation, for example, its digging, is done in a manner that can result in damage, and the one responsible for it is considered forewarned from its inception. You don't have to, leave a pit in the public domain and then somebody falls into it and gets hurt, and then you're considered forewarned that your pit is dangerous. Once you dig a pit in the public domain, you're forewarned, right? And any damage that it causes, you're fully liable for. Whereas with an ox, as we've seen, if it gores someone, the first time you did not have any reason to suspect that your ox would gore. Most oxen don't gore. But once it has gored a few times, then you're considered forewarned that your ox is a dangerous ox, and then you have to pay full damages if it hurts somebody, as opposed to the innocuous ox where you're only liable for half the damages. So you see that there's stringencies that apply to the pit that don't apply to the ox, and stringencies that apply to the ox that don't apply to the pit. We're on 10a. There is a stringency that applies to the category of the ox as opposed to fire, and conversely, there is a stringency that applies to fire as opposed to ox. The Brisa explains, the stringency that applies to the category of ox is as opposed to the category of fire, is that if an ox kills a Jew, the owner is liable to pay a ransom, and for killing the slave to pay 30 selah. Furthermore, in such a case, as we saw before, same stringencies of the ox, you can't use the carcass etc. And if one transfers his ox to the care of a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor, and it causes damage, he is liable. All of this is not so with regard to a fire. But the stringency that applies to a fire as opposed to the ox is that the one responsible for the fire is considered forewarned from its inception, which is not so with regard to an ox. Now, there's also a stringency that applies to a fire as opposed to a pit, and a stringency that applies only to the pit as opposed to the fire. And the Bryce explains the stringency that applies to the pit as opposed to the fire is that its initial formation, its digging, is done in a manner that can result in damage, and therefore you're considered forewarned. And this is not so with fire. The stringency that applies to fire as opposed to pit is that the typical manner of a fire is to proceed and cause damage, and the one responsible for it is considered forewarned with regard to consuming both something that is fitting for it and something that is not fitting for it, i.e. both flammable and non-flammable items. And this is not so with regard to a pit. We make a distinction for a pit that certain things you expect would fall into the pit and be harmed, but other things not. Whereas with a fire, anything that's harmed by the fire becomes your liability, becomes your responsibility, even things that we wouldn't ordinarily think could be harmed by the fire. And the Gemara asks, then I'm going to skip a few more of these nuances, the stringency of the ox that not everybody holds by. And we come along down near the bottom of page 10a. The Mishna states, in any case in which I facilitated part of the damage that it caused, I am liable for payments of restitution for the damage it caused as if I were the one who facilitated the entire damage that it caused. Right? So the first thing that comes to mind is, how are we going to understand this? Like if two guys were in charge of something, right? You two guard that ox, right? And then one guy wanders off. And now you needed two to guard the ox. One guy was negligent and left. So even though two people were charged, right? That guy by himself wasn't able to guard the ox by himself. So you can see where, one guy had partial responsibility, but when he wandered off, he's really the one that caused the harm. And so he's going to be held liable as if he caused all the harm, even though two people were charged with guarding the ox. And this is going to produce some interesting results, as we shall see. Skip a couple paragraphs because of time. And Rabbi Zera objects, and he says, no, what we're talking about, I'm not going to skip. Let me just read this. And the Gemara suggests, and this is not in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe, as it is taught in a baraisa, in the case of one who digs a pit to a depth of 9 handbreadths, and another person comes along and completes the digging to a depth of 10 handbreadths, well, then only the latter individual is liable for both injuries and death caused by the pit. Rebbe, and that is the law, but Rebbe says, with regard to death caused by the pit, the responsibility is ascribed to the latter individual. But with regard to damage caused by the pit, the responsibility is ascribed to the two of them. And Rav Papa said the Baraisa refers only to a digger's liability for death caused by a pit. And then the ruling of the Baraisa is unanimous, i.e. it is in accordance with the opinions of both the first Tana and Rebbe. And there are those who say that the preceding discussion was actually a little bit different. And the Gemara asks, shall we say that the Baraisa is not in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe? Rav Papa answered and said, the Baraisa refers only to a digger's liability for death caused by a pit, and then the ruling of the Baraisa is unanimous. In other words, if you dig a pit and it's fairly shallow, okay, if somebody gets hurt, you're definitely responsible for that. But if somebody dies because they fell into that, you're not liable for murder because you left a shallow pit. It would be very weird and unforeseeable that somebody died from falling into a shallow pit. But if it's sufficiently deep, then you would be liable. So what happens if one guy just digs a pretty shallow pit? Okay, it could cause harm, but it wouldn't cause death. But then another guy comes along and makes it a little deeper. So he only did a small part of the digging, but it was the part that took it from a shallow pit to a pit that's considered deep enough to cause death. And then someone does die. So are both of them liable together, or only the guy who deepened the pit? Now, Rabbi Zera objects to the explanation of the Baraisa, that the Mishnah is referring to only one specific case. What are you talking about? There's lots of situations, says Rabbi Zera, where multiple people contribute to a hazardous situation, but only one of them is going to be held liable when the actual damage happens, right? So he's going to say there's multiple examples of this. It's not just one guy who digs, who deepens a pit. There's other examples. Isn't there the case of one who transferred his ox to 5 individuals in order for them to safeguard it? And one of them was negligent in his duties, and then the ox caused damage. So isn't this individual liable for all the damage? And like in the case that I said before, there were 2 people charged with guarding an ox, and one of them wanders off. It's the one who wanders off who's liable. So Rabbi Zera is saying, okay, well, if there's 5 people that it was their job to guard an ox, and one of them wanders off, same thing. Because one of them wandered off, they didn't have the 5 that they needed, that ox caused damage, and so that one guy who wandered off, he's the one who's liable for all the damages. This seems to be an additional example of the principle in the Mishnah that if one facilitated part of the damage through his negligence, he is liable for payment of restitution of all of the damage that was caused, as if he were the one who did it by himself. Now, the Gemara rejects the possibility that the Mishnah would be referring to this case. What are the circumstances in which the negligent watchman bears full liability? If we say that without him, the ox would not have been properly safeguarded because the ox was particularly strong, and it took all 5 individuals to safeguard it, well, then it is obvious that the negligent individual is liable for all the damage. The reason is that he alone, through his negligence, caused all the damage, not just part of it. That's obvious. So rather, the case that we're talking about here must be where even without him, the ox would still have been sufficiently safeguarded. Okay, they brought in 5 guys, which was overkill just to make sure that the ox wouldn't do harm. So one of them wanders off. 4 is still plenty to guard the ox. But if that is the case, what did he do by not safeguarding it? If there was still plenty of guys, if the 4 guys remaining, could easily take care of the ox, then the one who wandered off and later the ox did damage, why is he going to be liable as if he did all the damage? That doesn't make sense either. So Rav Sheshis objects to this explanation of the Baraisa. But isn't there also the case of a fire that was left unattended by its owner? So there's a fire that was left unattended, and somebody comes along and adds a bundle of wood to it. Okay, so then the question, and then the fire spreads and causes a lot of harm. Starts a forest fire, burns down a house, something like that. So if the fire wouldn't have spread but for that last bundle of wood that was added by this guy, well, then obviously he's liable for all the damage. But if the fire would have spread without him adding that last bundle, then what difference does it make that he added the last bundle? So it must be that that's not what we're talking about. So Rav Papa says, but isn't there also, and now we're on 10b, but isn't there also that which is taught in a Baraisa with regard to a case in which 5 people were sitting on one bench and it did not break? And then one additional person came and sat on it and broke it with his added weight. Okay, so then the last individual is liable for all the damage, right? Because before he sat down, there were 5 guys on the bench. The bench could hold them. It was when the 6th guy sat down that the bench broke. So it would seem that the 6th guy shouldn't have added his weight. When he did, he's the one who broke the bench. And Rav Papa said, by way of clarification, that this applies in a case where the last individual to sit down was as heavy as Papa Bar Abba, since he could have potentially broken it even on his own. That's why he had no right to use it, which seemingly implies that if he's a regular guy, like there were 5 skinny guys on a bench and a 6th skinny guy came, and then the bench broke, he's not going to be responsible for the damage on his own. It seems like all 6 are responsible for this. In this case, even though the weight of the first 5 individuals was presumably a contributing factor in causing the damage, since the damage was ultimately caused by the additional weight of the last individual, he is liable for all the damage. But this is only if he was so fat that he could have broken it by himself. Seemingly, this is an additional example of the Mishnah's principle, and the Baraisa should have mentioned it. But the Gemara rejects this suggestion. What are the circumstances? If we say that without him, the bench would never have broken under the weight of the first 5 people, then it is obvious that the last individual is liable for all the damage, as ultimately it was his action alone that caused the damage. So rather, it must be that even without him, the bench would have broken under the weight of the first 5 people, and the last individual sat down just as it was about to break. So the Gemara asks, but if that is the case, what did he do? I.e., why should he be liable at all? It is apparent then that the Mishnah is not referring to this case. So the Gemara asks, okay, so ultimately, how is the Baraisa cited by Rav Papa to be explained? What are we saying about this bench with 5 guys? It wasn't breaking, a 6th guy sat down, and then it breaks. So what are we saying? The Gemara explains, it is necessary to say this in a case where, without the 6th guy, it would have broken in 2 hours. And now it broke in 1 hour. And the Baraisa teaches that the last individual alone is liable and not the first 5. Why? Because the first 5 can say to the last individual, were it not for you, we would have sat a little bit more and then we would have stood up. Consequently, the bench would never have broken. Therefore, it was ultimately you who caused the bench to break, and therefore only you are liable. Nice argument, but the Gemara rejects this suggestion because in that situation, the last guy would have a valid counterclaim. He would say to them, were it not for you continuing to sit on the bench after I sat down, the bench would not have broken, as under my weight alone, it would not have broken. Accordingly, we should all share the liability for damaging it. So the Gemara offers a different suggestion. No, it is necessary to say this case where instantaneously, as he was leaning upon the other 5 guys, the bench broke. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, it is obvious that he alone is liable. The 5 guys were sitting there, everything was fine. He comes along, sits on their laps or lies on their laps or leans on them, and then the bench breaks. Of course he's the one responsible for that. But the Gemara explains, actually the ruling is necessary lest you say that when one causes damage with one's direct force, it is not equivalent to a situation where one causes damage with one's body. If he broke the bench by actually sitting down on it, his action would be considered a direct act of damage completed with his body, and he alone would be liable, even though the other people's weight was a contributing factor. In this case, since he broke the bench by merely leaning upon the others who were actually sitting there, it is his force that led to the damage and not his body. And one might have thought that since the weight of the others certainly contributed to the breakage, they should share liability. Therefore, the Baraisa teaches us that causing damage with one's direct force is equivalent to causing damage with one's body. And it teaches that the law is that anywhere that one would be liable if his body broke something, one is also liable if his force broke something. Now, the Gemara continues to consider the possibility that there are additional cases where one is partially responsible for what happened, but he becomes liable to pay all of the damages. And are there not more cases? But isn't there also the case of that which was taught in a Baraisa? If one was beaten by 10 people with 10 sticks, whether they beat him simultaneously or one after the other, and he died, they are all exempt from liability for killing him. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, where they beat him sequentially, the last individual to beat him alone is liable because he has hastened his death. In this case, the other individuals contributed to the man's death, but the last one alone is liable. Why didn't the Baraisa also mention this case? I don't understand why if 10 guys beat one person with 10 sticks, they're all exempt from liability for killing him. Are we saying that they're not guilty of murder? Or are we saying that they're not liable for wrongful death? Are we saying that they're not liable for wrongful death because we can't figure out which one of them actually killed him, but why not all of them together? I mean, very tragically, there was a case like this just happened. I think it was in Las Vegas, right? And a young man was beaten by 10 or more boys, and he died. He was killed. And I believe I heard that the prosecutor in that city is going to bring charges against at least some of them because there was video of it. At any rate, the Gemara explains that the Baraisa is not speaking of one's liability to receive the death penalty, only one's liability to pay damages. And if you wish, say instead that the Baraisa is not speaking of an issue that is the subject of a dispute. And the Gemara asks, but isn't it? But didn't we uphold that the case stated in the Baraisa concerning a pit is subject to a dispute, and it is not in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe, but rather of the rabbis? So the Gemara explains, we will interpret the Baraisa to be in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis and not to be in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe, but we will not interpret it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. But we will not interpret it to be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera and not in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. In other words, although we will interpret the Baraisa as referring to a case that is subject to a dispute, that applies only if it is in accordance with the majority opinion in that dispute. The Mishnah teaches, in any case in which I facilitated part of the damage that it caused, I am liable for payments of restitution for the damage it caused, as if I were the one who facilitated the entire damage. It seems like we weren't able to, we argued about examples of this, but the principle is in our Mishnah, and so let's get back to the principle. So the Gemara notes that the Mishnah does not teach I am liable for the damage that it caused. Rather, I am liable for payments of restitution for damage that it caused. Why are we having these extra words? And what we're going to see is, right, if, for example, my ox kills your ox, right? So before you had a living ox, now you have a dead ox. What do I owe you? Do I owe you the cost of replacing your living ox? Or do I owe you the cost of replacing your living ox, your live ox, minus the value of the carcass that is now in your possession? Okay, my ox killed your ox, but you do have a dead ox. Your dead ox is certainly not worth as much as your live ox was, but it's worth something. So to make you whole, I have to give you the difference in value between your live ox and your dead ox, not replace your live ox, in which case you now have a live ox and a dead ox, and it would seem like a windfall. And so the Gemara notes, we already learned this, as the sages taught in a Baraisa, that the Mishnah uses the term payments of restitution for damage as opposed to simply stating one is liable for damage caused, and it alludes to this idea that I pay you the difference between the live ox and the dead ox. So the Gemara asks, from where do we derive this? How do we know that this is so? And Rabbi Ami said, as the verse states, one who strikes an animal shall pay for it. Yeshalamena, Leviticus 24:18. So do not read the final word as Yeshalamena, meaning he shall pay for it. Rather, read it as though it were vocalized Yashlimena, meaning he shall complete it, to teach that he shall complete the injured party's compensation. Right? That's why I pay the difference and not the replacement cost. Rav Kahana said that this law is derived from a different place. The verse states with regard to a case where an animal was entrusted with a paid bailee. What's a paid bailee? Here's my ox. I'm going out of town. I need it to be taken care of. Tom, I'm going to pay you $100. Take care of my ox. Now, obviously, Tom is going to have a greater responsibility to make sure that nothing happens to my ox and that my ox doesn't cause harm than if I just asked Tom as a favor to watch my ox. And that's going to be different than if Tom actually borrowed my ox to plow his own field, or if Tom rented my ox to plow his field. This is the paid bailee. I'm paying Tom to watch my ox and make sure it doesn't get in trouble. That's the paid bailee. So Rav Kahana says that where the Torah talks about the paid bailee, and one who did not fulfill his duty to safeguard the object, in my example, an ox, and that animal was attacked by a wild beast, right? I told him, watch my ox, and when I came back, there's a dead ox. Why? Because the ox was attacked by a lion. Well, obviously, Tom didn't do his job of locking up the ox at night in the barn. That's why the lion got to it. So now he owes me, right? And the Torah says, Exodus 22:12, if it be torn to pieces, let him bring a witness. A torn animal, he shall not pay. And Rav Kahana expounds the verse to mean that he shall pay only up until the value of the torn animal, but he shall not pay for the torn animal itself. In other words, Tom, who now owes me money, pays only the difference in value between the animal before it was injured and in its current torn state. If the owner of the injured animal wishes to fully recover his loss, he's going to have to sell the animal's carcass and keep the proceeds. Chizkiah said that this law is actually derived from a third verse in the Torah. The verse states, with regard to a person's ox that fatally gored another person's ox, he shall pay an ox for the ox, and the carcass shall be his. Exodus 21:36, meaning the carcass belongs to the injured party, the owner of the gored animal. And similarly, the school of Chizkiah taught in a Baraisa, the verse states, and the carcass shall be his. And the verse means the carcass belongs to the injured party. Do you say it belongs to the injured party? Or perhaps it belongs only to the one liable for the damage? To this suggestion, you should say, it could not have been that. And the Gemara says, why not? And Abaye says, if it enters your mind to say that the animal carcass is the property of the one liable for the damage, so let the merciful one write, he shall pay an ox for the ox. And then be silent and state no more. Why do I need the verse to continue? And the carcass shall be his? Conclude from it that the carcass belongs to the injured party. I'm going to skip a few paragraphs. Rav Kahana said to Rav, but according to the statement of Chizkiah as explained by Abaye, the only reason the injured party retains ownership of the carcass is that the merciful one wrote, and the carcass shall be his. But were it not for that, I would say that the carcass is the property of the one liable to make restitution, to pay for the damage. And Rav Kahana questions the need for the Torah to teach this. Now, if the one liable for the damage had in his possession the carcasses of several torn animals, he could give the injured party a carcass as payment. As the master said above on page 7a, the verse states, he shall recompense, to include items worth money, even bran, a relatively inferior commodity, as valid items with which to pay restitution. So is it necessary for the Torah to teach that he can pay restitution with his own, with the injured party's animal carcass? Granting ownership of the carcass to the injured party seems pointless, because even had the Torah granted it to the one liable for the damage, he could give it to the injured party as payment. I'm so close to done. Questions, get them in. So the Gemara explains it is necessary only for the issue of who sustains the loss due to the diminishing value of the carcass between the death and when the case is brought before the court. By granting ownership of the carcass to the injured party from the moment of the animal's death, the Torah limits the damages to the difference between the value of the animal when it was alive and its value immediately after it is killed, irrespective of what happens to the carcass afterward. That's where we're going to stop for today. Let's see if we've got some comments or questions on Bava, Kamma 9 and 10. Nina says, lots of questions and comments. Not sure if we have time for all of them. So I'll just go in order of what I can do. Bill, question to be sure. I've understood the difference between fire and pit correctly. If you had a cart which you tied up on a slope and the knot came undone and the cart rolled away and hit another person's cart, damaging it, that's fire because it moved, right? I would say yes, as opposed to a pit, which is stationary and people stumble on it. Lucy, about the two brothers. I thought we learned a creditor could not collect from orphans, but maybe I am remembering this wrong. Excellent question. I was thinking that as we were reading it. And I think what happens is there's a difference between a lien that runs with land, even when orphans inherit it, as opposed to the money and movable property in the estate, which I think that the creditor could not seize because it belongs to orphans to satisfy a debt. But if there was a lien on property, that does work. Real property. Sharon isn't the guy who deepened the pit likened to one who completes the task, making the completing person the one who is responsible. Yes, just so. Marjorie, under Georgia law, an equine activity sponsor or an equine professional is not liable for an injury to or the death of a participant due to inherent risks of animal activities. So very interesting. But right, so in other words, if you rent a horse to somebody, is that what you're saying? You rent a horse to somebody, then they hurt themselves while they're riding the horse. They knowingly undertook that risk. I mean, I'm sure that in the United States, there's always waivers, right? You have to sign a waiver. And here we haven't talked anything about can somebody explicitly assume the risk of doing something, and therefore the one who it was incumbent on him to safeguard is excused from liability. And I think probably it would work because, in other words, that kind of waiver does work, is even included within what we're discussing, because it says if the responsibility to safeguard and a fire, pit, and ox from harming others is incumbent on you. But if somebody comes along and assumes that risk explicitly, okay, so then it's no longer on you to safeguard it from causing the harm. And finally, Jonathan, regarding the bench, feels like there would be liability only if the capacity was labeled, i.e. if the elevator says a weight limit. Then the last person on should determine if he is going to add weight beyond the limit. But if it's not labeled, I'm not sure I agree. The other people on the bench have some responsibility for saying don't sit. Very good. What if they say don't sit and he sits? Then definitely it's him. But if they're silent, probably no one knows. No one knows. But are we going to say that the one who added the last bit, the straw that broke the camel's back, as it were? I feel like we only mentioned that Baraisa in passing as additional examples, but I feel like we haven't really resolved this question. I don't think we know, who it is with the bench, except let's read what the law came out on this, because I think there is a halacha about the bench. Okay, 5 people sitting on a bench. Where did the law end up? This is why I love the Koran Talmud. It tells you. If 5 people were sitting on a bench belonging to another, and it did not break, and then one additional person sat upon it or leaned upon it in such a way that he did not allow the others to get up, and the bench broke, even if it would have eventually broken under the weight of the first 5 people, since the last person hastened the process, he is liable for the damage. But only if he sat in such a way that he doesn't allow the others to get up. So if they have the choice of getting up now that he sits down and they choose to stay down, they do share in the liability for breaking the bench. Some opinions rule that this applies only in the case where the people sitting upon it were unusually heavy, as otherwise the case would be comparable to one who borrows an animal that dies while performing its typical work, in which case the borrower is exempt from liability because presumably there was something wrong with the animal. If you borrowed a donkey to carry a reasonable load for donkeys and it died from that load, okay, so you're not liable for that because it was just, you were doing what you said you were gonna do with the donkey. It happened to die while it was in your possession, but it would have died just the same if the owner was using the donkey for the same purpose. If you overburden the donkey, of course you become liable for it, right? So in this case, if the bench was just being used in a reasonable way and people sat on it and it broke, okay, well then they're not liable because the bench, unbeknownst to the people sitting on it, had been weakening for a while and it was due to break. It just happened to break when they were there. There's a lot of issues that come to bear when we decide liability. And that's what makes the whole discussion of torts and civil liability and paying damages, in my mind, so interesting. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we're together again tomorrow, Wednesday, at the regular